This marble statue in Washington stands 19 feet tall, a silent monument to a national savior. But the man who actually sat for the early portraits faced a crisis that threatened to prove the American experiment was a logical failure. By 1856, the U.S. was a political powder keg. As this map shows, no instructions on maintaining the Union. Winning the coming war required more than troop movements. It required a specific, self-taught legal framework to account for a nation breaking its own rules. Beyond commanding an army, Lincoln had to reconstruct the logic of the American Union while its very premises were under fire. Lincoln was born on a dirt floor in a one-room Kentucky cabin. His youth was defined by extreme poverty and the early trauma of losing his mother when he was only 9 years old. He spent his nights educating himself by the firelight to avoid a life of manual labor, despite having less than a year of formal schooling. He spent his early 20s absorbing borrowed legal textbooks until the mechanics of the law became his second language. The law became his intellectual anchor. It trained his mind to take emotional, volatile problems and reduce them to undeniable mathematical truths. Because he lacked a traditional education, his entire worldview was built on the pure, rational mechanics of legal argument, rather than inherited political tradition. In 1854, the threat of slavery expanding into the West pulled Lincoln back into the political arena, forcing him to apply his legal training to the national crisis. In 1858, he challenged the powerful Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Their debates became a national spectacle, pitting Douglas's political experience against Lincoln's relentless deductive reasoning. Lincoln used those debates to present his House Divided theorem. He argued that a house divided against itself cannot stand, logically deducing that the government could not endure permanently as a mix of slave and free states. This singular argument propelled him to the presidency in 1860. It was a victory that immediately triggered the South's secession, effectively putting his theorem to the ultimate test. His legal deduction had correctly identified that the conflict was an absolute necessity years before the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. By 1862, the Union was losing. Hesitant generals and staggering casualties led to a public outcry, with much of the blame falling directly on Lincoln. During this national disaster, Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, died in the White House. Losing a child while blamed for the deaths of thousands left Lincoln in a deep melancholy, forcing him to seek a more absolute solution. He realized the original goal, fighting a war simply to preserve the existing Union, was failing both practically and morally. The Emancipation Proclamation was his strategic recalculation. It was a cold, legal move to break the rebellion. Striking at the economic heart of the South, it converted the Confederacy's labor force into a Union asset, ensuring the South could no longer sustain its war effort. It also functioned as a geopolitical shield. By making the war about the eradication of slavery, Lincoln ensured that no European power could legally or morally intervene to help the South. He had transformed a failing military operation into a triumphant crusade, using the law to ensure that the Union's victory would be final. Even as the tide of the war turned, the cost was visible in the hollowed-out shells of American cities and the thousands of lives lost. At Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered a 2-minute address that served as his final, airtight public argument. He used the occasion to synthesize the war's suffering into a new definition of American freedom. He concluded that the only way to justify such a massive sacrifice of life was to ensure that a government of the people, by the people, for the people, would never perish. Days after the war ended, Lincoln was assassinated. He died before he could oversee the reconstruction of the nation he spent 4 years holding together. He began his life as an uneducated boy in a mud-floor cabin and died having drafted the legal and moral roadmap for a new United States. Lincoln's ability was to take the weight of national and personal loss and process it through the cold, legal logic he learned in the wilderness. By doing so, he converted the Union's darkest hours into a definitive mandate for universal freedom.